5 minutes before the moment I thought I would die, Damian Moretti, the Mafia boss whose name makes people tremble, stood in the smoke and said the exact line I drunkenly sent him by mistake. "If you still want me, say the word." I was tied to a chair, wrists burning, Marco screaming in the corner. Damian came alone, no guards, no weapons hidden under his coat, just with eyes that looked like he had already decided he would die with me if I didn't answer. So I screamed, "I want you!" And the moment the second explosion shook the concrete floor, I understood. Every disaster in my life had started from that one sentence, that one flirty text, sent to the wrong number. I am Ava Collins. It's funny how something so small can tip your whole world over, right? That night, I was sitting in my tiny kitchen, the kind of space where the fridge hums louder than your thoughts, and the linoleum smells faintly of old cleaner and regret. And I was just trying to forget that Julian had been gone for 3 months. He wasn't my boyfriend, not officially, but he was that one person you cling to when everything else feels like it's slipping. That person who makes you feel like you might actually be seen for 5 minutes, like maybe your quiet existence matters. And then he just vanished, leaving me feeling pretty hollow and a little bit used, carrying the quiet, crushing weight of being perpetually overlooked, always the girl in the background. I'd had a few too many glasses of cheap wine, the kind that tastes like regret but gets the job done and makes your defenses melt away until you feel reckless. And I was scrolling through my phone, staring at the number I hadn't deleted yet, Julian's number, remembering the brief, fleeting moments in dusty coffee shops where I thought I might actually matter to someone important, someone successful. My fingers were heavy, sluggish, and my mind was clouded with a desperate, stupid bravado, trying to work up the courage to send something, anything, just to prove I wasn't invisible, to prove he still cared, even just a little. A last, desperate attempt to reclaim a tiny piece of dignity he had stolen when he walked out. I typed out the line, the one that felt both desperate and challenging. "If you still want me, say the word." A silly, movie-line demand. And then I blinked, trying to clear the fuzzy vision, and hit send with a sudden, reckless finality, only to realize maybe 2 seconds later that the contact name on the screen wasn't Julian Hart, whose photo was a generic silhouette. It was Damian Moretti, a name I'd saved weeks ago when I was doing freelance social media cleanup for one of his legitimate-looking, surprisingly boring asset management businesses, fixing some complex security issues and scrubbing old vulnerable accounts. And I'd kept it, honestly, just because the name looked cool and I liked the strange, imposing symmetry of the digits that looked like a code themselves. My blood turned instantly to ice, the kind of freezing panic that makes your chest lock up and the floor seem to drop out from under you, because I knew, even in my state, that sending a flirty, demanding text to a man like that wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophic, seismic event that had just put a massive neon target on my entirely unremarkable life. I threw the phone onto the worn counter, jumping back like it had burned me, heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. And I swore out loud, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed in the empty apartment, instantly regretting the impulsive stupidity of the entire night, wishing I could rewind 5 minutes and pour that last glass of wine down the sink. I scrambled to pick it back up, fumbling with the screen, intending to delete the message immediately, praying the delivery hadn't gone through or that his phone was on silent, that he was too busy to notice. But as the screen lit up, my stomach dropped even further because there was a reply, already there, instant and sharp, like a bullet hitting glass, confirming receipt and acknowledgement. It just said, "I already want you." That single line was so much worse than the original text. It was unnerving, completely humorless, void of any irony or flirtation, and held a chilling certainty, a terrifying finality that made the hairs on my arms stand up and every drop of wine-induced warmth disappear, replaced by cold dread. I hit the delete button, watching the chat history scrub itself clean, but it didn't matter. The message was received, the communication acknowledged, and the door to my old life had just slammed shut. Damian Moretti had seen it. He had replied to it, and the very air in my little apartment suddenly felt thick with an unknown, dangerous tension, like I'd just accidentally triggered a highly sensitive, volatile trap I didn't even know existed within his organization. I spent the next 5 minutes pacing the tiny kitchen floor, back and forth, dragging my hands through my hair, trying to convince myself that a man like him, busy running an empire of businesses and shadows, wouldn't spare a second thought for a drunk text from some low-level contractor he barely remembered. But the sinking feeling in my gut, the one that had been with me my whole life, told me that when you're dealing with that kind of power, everything is noticed, everything is filed away, and there is absolutely no such thing as an accident or a coincidence, only opportunity. And that's when the neighborhood went silent, completely and instantly, which is something that never happens in my building because it sits right next to a busy avenue, and there's always a siren wailing, always a fight breaking out on the corner, always something noisy going on to cover the sound of your own frantic thoughts. The sudden, unnatural quiet was the real alarm bell. I stopped pacing, holding my breath so tight it hurt, and I walked slowly, almost on tiptoe, to the dusty window, pulling the edge of the cheap, faded blind back with a trembling finger, praying I wouldn't see what I knew I would see, trying to deny the reality that had just arrived. Down on the street, the usually chaotic mess of parked cars and overflowing trash cans was neatly framed by a line of massive, polished black SUVs, the kind that cost more than I'd make in 10 years. The kind of vehicles that announce power with silent, intimidating weight. And they were lined up perfectly, engine off, just sitting there like silent, imposing monoliths. The whole street, my neighbors, who are usually leaning out windows to catch the drama, or sitting on stoops gossiping, they all just froze, their heads tilted back, watching the cars with a mixture of terror and awe, and I could hear the panicked, hushed whispers floating up even from 2 floors below. "She's in trouble again. That poor girl finally messed with the wrong people. I told her to move out years ago." I pulled my hand away from the blind, letting it snap shut, and I just stood there in the dark, my heart thudding a panicked, deafening rhythm against my ribs, realizing that the chaotic mess of my life, the quiet desperation I usually managed to contain with so much effort, had just exploded all over the street for everyone to witness. And the man who ruled that chaos, the one who held the entire city in his cold, controlled palm, was standing right outside my door, or maybe getting out of one of those cars, and he was coming for me. Not for a date, but for answers I didn't have to his mistaken interpretation. Before I go on, I just want to pause for a second. If you've ever felt that pit in your stomach fear, that moment when everything you thought was safe suddenly isn't, when you realize that one small mistake has massive, irreversible consequences, then you know this feeling deep in your bones, that sense of total vulnerability. It's hard to talk about this part, about the fear and the humiliation, about being judged on your doorstep. But it's important to remember that even when you feel small and invisible, when the whole world is judging you, you're not alone in those moments. So, if you're watching right now, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, open your phone and leave a comment below telling me one time you were underestimated, when someone thought they had you figured out, and they were completely wrong, when your quiet strength surprised them, and please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me keep sharing these stories and walking this journey with you, reminding us all that strength comes in quiet moments too. Thank you, truly. The knock on my door wasn't aggressive, didn't rattle the wood or sound demanding, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was firm, measured, and completely non-negotiable, the kind of knock that says, "I know you're in there, I know everything about this situation, and you will open this door." Not a request, but a command. I wiped my wet cheeks with the back of my hand, took a deep, shuddering breath that didn't quite fill my lungs, and gave myself a final, frantic pep talk, telling myself that I was a strong woman, a resilient survivor of bad jobs and worse exes, and I could handle a simple misunderstanding with a very powerful, very dangerous businessman, as long as I kept my composure and stuck to the truth. I slowly turned the deadbolt, trying to keep my face composed and blank, and pulled the door open just a crack, ready to launch into a practiced, stammering explanation about a client's old phone, a contact list mix-up, and an embarrassing amount of cheap wine. but the sight of him stopped the words dead in my throat, freezing them into a useless lump of fear. Damien Moretti didn't just stand in a doorway. He filled it, radiating an intense, cold energy, a quiet kind of controlled violence that made the cramped hallway feel instantly smaller and the world outside seem impossibly far away. He was wearing an impeccably tailored black suit that looked like armor, so perfect it was almost intimidating. His dark hair slicked back without a single strand out of place, and his eyes, a piercing shade of pale gray, looked directly into mine. A look of unnerving, total recognition, like he'd been waiting for me to open that door for years, like this meeting was inevitable. He didn't offer a friendly smile or an intimidating glare. He simply looked at me, taking in my cheap, wine-stained shirt, my frayed jeans, and the evidence of my ordinary chaos. But somehow, he didn't look dismissive. He looked deeply curious and intensely focused, the look of a man who has just found the missing piece to a critical puzzle. "I came because you called," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards and settle in my bones, confirming the gravity of the situation with his first words. I finally found my voice, but it came out small and tight. Definitely not the voice of a strong, resilient woman. "I texted the wrong person. It was a mistake. I was trying to reach someone else. I was drinking. I looked down, completely mortified by the reality of the situation, ready for him to scoff or to rage, for the cold judgment to descend. But when I looked up again, his expression hadn't changed. It was still that unnerving mix of recognition and intense, almost dangerous focus, an expression that clearly stated he dealt only in cold logic. "There is no wrong, Ava, only fate, and in my world there are no accidents." He used my name, which sent a fresh jolt of fear through me because I hadn't given it to him since that brief, professional encounter weeks ago, confirming he knew exactly who I was and had tracked me. Then, his gaze drifted down my body, not in a cheap or predatory way, but in a way that was detailed and analytical, taking in every piece of my appearance and surroundings, his eyes missing nothing, processing the details of my low-status life. The faded blue denim, worn thin at the knee, the scent of lily and disappointment, a contradiction, as lilies should only bloom in abundance, and that little silver chain you wear with the tiny anchor charm, a strange symbol for a woman who seems adrift, but who clings to stability. I instinctively reached up and touched the charm, a relic from my grandmother, a small piece of comfort, realizing with a sickening certainty that he hadn't just noticed me in passing. He had catalogued me, the quiet, unassuming girl who fixed his client's phone, who worked in the shadows of the internet, and he had remembered every tiny personal detail, making him terrifyingly intimate. He reached out and gently took my elbow, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost careful, but firm enough to let me know I had no choice in the matter, that the decision had already been made, and my explanation was irrelevant to the larger game. It was in that moment, with his hand on my elbow, that I realized he didn't believe my story about the wrong number. Not at all, because in his world, people like me don't make mistakes. They make calculated moves under duress. He held my gaze, and I could see the cold, calculating intelligence working behind his eyes, piecing together a scenario that had nothing to do with cheap wine and everything to do with internal betrayal and a plea for help. "Your message was the code," he stated, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry past the doorway, making my honest explanation about Julian and the cheap wine feel pathetic and utterly unbelievable. "A distress signal, a warning of compromised security, a plea for extraction. You used the line, the one only we know from a historical file, and I came immediately. I stared at him, my mind reeling, scrambling to figure out what kind of twisted, high-stakes world he lived in, where a desperate, drunken text was a coded distress signal used by a traitor or an insider in his operation. And I knew the absolute truth. The mundane, humiliating reality of my recklessness would only sound like a clumsy, unconvincing lie to him. He misinterpreted my shocked silence as complicity, Or maybe even agreement to play along with the lie he was constructing for the sake of our safety. And he nodded. A slight, decisive movement of his head. "You've been compromised. You are no longer safe here. Someone saw you send that message and the reply you received." He gently pulled me out of my apartment, past the wide-eyed, whispering neighbors who would forever mark this as the day Ava Collins fell into the deep end, and marched me toward the line of black SUVs waiting on the street, treating me like a priceless, fragile package he was meant to protect. While I was just trying to figure out how to tell a mafia boss that I was only a small-time social media manager who couldn't even manage her own life, let alone his high-stakes geopolitical dramas. The ride to his penthouse was a blur of tinted windows, heavy silence, and the nauseating knowledge that I was trapped in a situation that was completely not my fault, yet entirely my responsibility. My stupid text was the catalyst, regardless of my intent, and I was now a pawn in a game I didn't know the rules to. The car smelled of expensive leather and gunpowder, a terrifying mix of luxury and violence. When we finally arrived, the building was everything my life wasn't: sleek, silent, and intimidatingly perfect. A tower of polished glass and steel overlooking the entire city. A cold, unfeeling monument to cold, hard power. Damien pulled me from the car, his hand still a firm, possessive weight on my arm, leading me through the massive, echoing lobby where everything gleamed, and into a private elevator that whisked us up to the highest floor with silent speed. But as the elevator doors opened, the quiet, controlled atmosphere shattered instantly, and I was confronted by a group of his men, standing in the marble hallway, all of them big, all of them wearing the same expression of cold, professional contempt and outright suspicion. Their eyes dark and judging. They looked me up and down, taking in my messy hair, my cheap clothes, and the lingering scent of stale wine, the quiet evidence of my low-status life. And their sneers were immediate and brutal. The kind of judgment that cuts straight to your core, confirming every insecurity I had about myself and my lack of place in their world. "Boss likes dumb girls he can control, huh? A quick replacement for the old stock. Something simple that won't ask questions," one of them muttered, loud enough to be heard by everyone, not even bothering to lower his voice, treating me like a piece of furniture or a passing amusement. Another one, a massive man with scarred knuckles, his eyes lingering on me for a fraction too long with a predatory glint, made a dismissive hand gesture as if I were a speck of dust that had ruined the polished environment. Must be nice to work with the boss for protection. That kind of promotion usually comes with a heavy price, and the terms are usually non-negotiable. I felt my cheeks flush crimson, the humiliation scalding, because in their eyes, I wasn't an insider or a secret agent. I was the oldest cliché in the book, a cheap distraction, a conquest the boss had brought home for amusement, a testament to his fleeting, low taste that they could openly judge. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to try and explain, to tell them I was Ava Collins, a hard-working freelancer who had simply misdialed and didn't belong in their dark world. But before I could get a single word out, a new figure stepped into the hallway, a woman whose beauty was sharp and unforgiving, like a perfectly faceted diamond meant to draw blood and blind onlookers. This was Serena Vale, Damien's ex-lover, and she looked at me with an immediate, icy loathing that was truly terrifying, like a queen discovering a rat in her castle, a foreign element that needed to be exterminated. Serena didn't speak, not at first. She simply walked toward me, her designer heels clicking on the marble floor like a death march countdown, and her face was a mask of cold fury and entitled fury, the kind of woman who had never been told no. Before I could even register what was happening, before I could brace myself, her hand snapped out, hard and quick, and she slapped me across the face with an audible crack that echoed off the marble walls, designed to humiliate and break me in front of everyone. The impact stunned me, sending a shockwave through my head and making my ears ring and my vision swim, leaving a burning red imprint on my cheek. Using secret codes to seduce men? Pathetic. A low-class attempt to bypass the rules, she hissed, her voice dripping with poison and entitled contempt, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated, power-hungry ambition. furious that this nobody had dared to infringe on her territory. I could feel the sudden, overwhelming sting of tears welling up, not just from the slap, but from the raw, public humiliation of being mistaken for something so low, so weak, so completely not me, of being reduced to a sexual conquest and a liar in a single painful moment. I didn't cry, though. I just bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, tasting the metallic tang of blood, and I focused on meeting her gaze, not with defiance, but with a quiet, unyielding dignity, refusing to crumble, even as I fell backward, a silent promise to myself that this woman would not see me break or beg. I landed hard on the cold floor, the rush of air knocked out of me, and I looked up at Damien, searching his face for any kind of help, any kind of belief in my innocence, any sign that he knew the truth. But he was completely silent. He just stood there, his face completely unreadable, watching the scene unfold with cold, detached intensity. And in that agonizing moment of silence, I realized he hadn't protected me. Not because he was cruel, but because he was still assessing me. Still weighing the evidence, still wondering if I was the innocent fool I claimed to be, or the dangerous, calculating insider his men, and Serena believed I was. He was watching how I took the pain, how I reacted to the public disgrace. In his world, trust wasn't a gift you received. It was a fortress you built. Brick by painful, humiliating brick, and I hadn't even laid the first stone, and I realized he needed to know what kind of woman I was when pushed to the absolute limit. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and I knew that every attempt to explain, every stammered defense, would only confirm their belief that I was weak and deceptive. I simply pushed myself up, slowly, deliberately, rubbing the throbbing spot on my cheek, not looking at anyone's face but keeping my eyes fixed on the door, and walked past them all, my steps silent on the thick carpet, heading for the first closed door I could find, which turned out to be a massive guest room, where I collapsed onto the pristine white bed, the burning shame finally giving way to a cold, hard resolve to get out of there, with or without his help, to get back my own sense of self. I spent the next hour lying rigid on the bed, staring at the perfectly sculpted crown molding on the ceiling, listening to the muffled, heavy sounds of the penthouse below, the voices of men who decided my worth by my appearance and my circumstances, and the cold, unyielding silence of the man who held my life in his hands. Every nerve ending screamed at me to run, to disappear, to get back to my own messy, small life, where the biggest risk was a client not paying an invoice, not a slap from a jealous mobster's ex, or an accidental coded message that had clearly marked me for death. The feeling of being completely out of my depth, of having zero control over my own destiny, was suffocating. I realized that whether I was a drunk girl who sent a wrong text or a clever spy, the result was the same. I was viewed as disposable and potentially dangerous, and the only path was out. Finally, unable to bear the captivity, the judgment, and the suffocating atmosphere another minute, I slipped out of the room, creeping down the hallway like a shadow, my cheap, thin-strapped purse, containing my phone and my grandmother's anchor charm, clutched tightly against my chest, the only two possessions that felt truly mine and offered a connection to reality. I reached the service elevator, convinced I was making the biggest mistake of my life, but determined to take that chance rather than spend another second under Damien's calculating gaze, when the entire world seemed to lurch violently, the sound so immediate and brutal that it knocked the breath right out of my body. The sound was unimaginable, a tearing, concussive roar that felt like it ripped the air out of my lungs, followed by an immediate, terrifying rush of heat and a shower of fine, stinging debris that smelled heavily of sulfur and burned chemicals. The service elevator light flickered once, violently, and then died, plunging the small space into pitch darkness and sealing me momentarily in the box and the main hallway where I had just been standing, where Damien and his men had been just moments before, was instantly engulfed in fire and thick, choking black smoke. The realization was instant. It wasn't a fire, it was a bomb. I slammed myself back against the wall, covering my head instinctively. the sound of falling debris and shattering glass deafening, realizing with a sick, dizzying certainty that the penthouse had just exploded, a massive, calculated blast. And if I had stayed, if I hadn't made that desperate, reckless, humiliated dash for the door, I would be dead right now, buried under rubble and ash. The heat was intense, pushing me back into the corner, the smoke searing my lungs, and I could hear the panicked shouts and coughing from the direction of the main floor, the kind of chaos that only comes from a sudden, brutal, and completely unexpected attack meant to eliminate leadership. Just when I thought I was going to pass out from the smoke and the sheer terror of being trapped, a figure materialized out of the swirling blackness, moving with an impossible speed and focus that cut right through the pandemonium. It was Damien. His perfectly tailored suit was ripped in several places, smudged heavily with soot, and he had a long, deep, bleeding gash across his forehead. But his eyes were clear, focused only on me, looking past the terror to find the one thing he was looking for in the immediate aftermath. He grabbed my arm, pulling me roughly but carefully away from the fire's reach, his strength immense, dragging me down the emergency stairs as alarms blared and sirens began to wail in the distance, announcing the end of the world as I knew it. When we finally stumbled out onto a lower, safe floor, the chaos still raging above us, he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, his face a mask of disbelief and profound shock, the cold control finally fractured by the reality of near death and the failure of his security. "Your message," he gasped out, his voice raw and strained, shaking his head slowly as the full magnitude of what had happened settled over him. The ultimate, terrifying irony of my blunder. It saved us both. If you hadn't been so humiliated that you left right then, forcing me to check on you, I wouldn't have followed the chaos, trying to figure out where you went. I would have stayed upstairs, finalizing the night's schedule right where the blast originated. He pulled a small, incredibly thin tablet from an inside pocket of his ruined jacket, his fingers flying across the screen with practiced speed, checking the security feeds and message logs, his gaze intense and analytical even in the immediate aftermath of an attempted assassination, prioritizing intelligence over injury. He watched the footage, replaying the moments leading up to the explosion, confirming that I had done nothing but grab my purse and head for the stairs, the ultimate act of self-preservation, not sabotage. He found the message log, the only thing there being my original drunken text and his chilling response. Nothing else. No further communication. No coded instructions. Nothing that proved I was the insider he suspected. He looked at me then. Truly looked at me. And his eyes, which had been so cold and calculating, now held a fierce, unyielding light. A new kind of intensity I hadn't seen before. A dangerous blend of gratitude and commitment. A silent acknowledgement that he owed me. "Someone used your text, your attempt to flee, to mask an assassination attempt," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. The conclusion already drawn. The promise already made. The explosion was timed for the moment I would have gone back to my study after the initial confrontation with Serena. Your innocent mistake threw off their entire timeline and saved us both. He dropped the tablet into the debris, reaching out and pulling me into his arms, the action sudden and fierce, his grip strong and fiercely protective, and I could feel the hard, unyielding reality of his body against mine, a confirmation that we were both alive, both victims of a world I didn't understand, but now irrevocably linked by fate. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled my lungs, mixing with the expensive, powerful scent of his cologne, and I knew in that moment that my life, the quiet, humble life of Ava Collins, was definitively and spectacularly over, traded for a life of danger and fierce protection. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, ignoring the sirens and the chaos that was unfolding around us, his focus absolute and singular. "From now on, you stay with me, by my side, always. You are the disruption they didn't anticipate, and now you are my shield." It wasn't a question or a request. It was a cold, deadly serious directive, a vow sealed by blood and fire. My accidental text hadn't just saved his life. It had marked me as a key player in his war, a target now wrapped in his protection, and I was too tired, too shaken, too overwhelmed by the events of the last hour to do anything but nod. The small movement sealing my fate and binding me to him forever. A life sentence of commitment. The next few weeks were a confusing whirlwind of movement, constant security checks, new safe houses, and the terrifying alien reality of living under Damien Moretti's roof. His constant, intense presence a weighty anchor I could never ignore. We moved 3 times in 7 days, never staying in one location long enough to feel safe. The fear a constant, low-level hum under my skin. I tried to keep busy, sorting through his legitimate business papers, organizing his digital assets, trying to act like a normal person in a completely abnormal situation, carrying myself with the quiet dignity I'd learned from a lifetime of being overlooked, refusing to be reduced to the frightened victim everyone expected. But the world, especially the world Damien inhabited, wasn't ready to let me just exist as his quiet assistant. The true humiliation, the one that broke me down internally, came not from the mobsters, but from my own past. The pieces of my life that Julian Hart and Serena Vale weaponized and threw back at me with surgical precision, attempting to sever my growing connection to Damien. I was standing in the massive, echoing hall of a mandatory charity gala Damien was forced to attend. An event dripping with old money, blinding jewelry, and colder judgments, where every whispered word carried weight, trying to blend into the shadows, feeling utterly exposed. That's when Julian, my old crush, the man who had abandoned me, approached with a sickeningly charming smile and a glint of cruel calculation in his eyes, his voice dripping with false intimacy, smelling of old, fake promises. He didn't say anything loving or remorseful. He just leaned close, his breath smelling faintly of expensive scotch and deceit, and whispered, "You have no idea who you just got involved with, Ava. You're punching so far above your weight, it's hilarious, and you're going to drag him down. But don't worry, darling. Everyone else will see exactly who you are soon enough." The implication was clear. He was going to expose my humble origins and my instability to the very elite Damien was trying to impress, and then, with a casual, devastating shrug, he turned his back on me and walked confidently toward a nearby news reporter who was setting up a camera, his smile widening as he began to talk, his voice carrying clearly in the temporarily quiet room, immediately drawing the attention of the surrounding elite, who lived for scandal. Julian, who I'd thought was just a charming guy in a boring office job, publicly began to tear my past apart, twisting a painful but ultimately insignificant firing from a previous social media job, a place where I'd simply refused to participate in fraudulent data practices, a small act of moral courage, into a public character assassination. She's irresponsible, unreliable, incapable of following direction and prone to dramatic outbursts, he stated, his voice ringing with false concern, painting a vivid picture of me as a flighty, unstable liability, someone who couldn't even keep a minimum wage job, incapable of handling anything of consequence, let alone standing beside a powerful man like Damien Moretti. The words, so familiar from my own deep-seated self-doubt, stung with a sharp, unexpected cruelty, because they were being used not to hurt me personally, but to strategically weaken Damien by association, to make me a toxic, easily dismissed anchor around his formidable neck, suggesting his judgment was flawed. Just as the whispers started to spread through the opulent crowd, the murmurs of judgment growing louder, Serena Vale, the perfect, venomous diamond, finished the job with a brutal efficiency I had to grudgingly respect. She made sure that old, embarrassing videos of me, drunk, rambling about my failures and loneliness to my phone camera, dancing awkwardly and miserably in my tiny, cheap apartment while the wine took hold, crying about bills, found their way onto various anonymous social media accounts, and worse, into the private group chats of the elite circle, becoming instant viral fodder for their contempt. The content showed me as exactly what they expected: poor, desperate, and unstable. The next morning, I was no longer the mysterious, potentially dangerous insider. I was a pathetic laughingstock, the useless girl who had flirted her way into power, A drunk, chaotic mess who was clearly unfit to stand in the shadow of a man like Damien, a woman whose true colors were dirt-stained and cheap. The men who worked for him, the ones who had been watching me, started whispering, louder and more confident this time. Boss is losing control because of that useless girl. She's too much trouble, and she brings chaos to the stability he needs. The judgment, the mockery, the cold, hard contempt. It all slammed into me at once, making me feel like a cosmic joke. A small-town girl who had accidentally walked onto the wrong stage and completely humiliated herself on a global scale. I finally broke down that night, not with loud, dramatic sobs or shouting, but with a silent, internal shattering. The feeling of being utterly exposed and completely worthless, convinced that I was a stain on Damien's world and a curse on his life, bringing nothing but danger and scorn. But that kind of pain, the kind that scrapes you clean and leaves you with nothing but your own quiet core, also leaves you sharp, focused, and incredibly angry. I looked at the videos, at the vicious comments, at Julian and Serena's perfectly orchestrated smear campaign, and something clicked inside me, a cold, methodical determination taking root. They underestimated me, always, because I was quiet and unassuming, and they thought my only skill was scrolling social media, understanding popular trends. They completely missed that my real skill was seeing things, the digital shadows people leave behind, the tiny, almost invisible trails of data and metadata that everyone else ignores. I started watching Serena, not physically, but digitally, quietly and methodically, using the same tech-savvy skills I used for my freelance clients, the skills I had developed fixing complicated data breaches and ghost accounts. Only this time, the stakes were life and death. Not just an invoice, but my life and Damien's. I needed to prove my worth, not with emotional appeals or tearful explanations, but with cold, hard facts. Because I knew Damien didn't deal in feelings. He dealt in loyalty, undeniable evidence, and truth. And I needed to give him a piece of truth that no one else could have possibly found. The kind of truth only visible to an outsider. It took me 3 days of careful, almost surgical digital snooping, staying up late in the quiet solitude of the guest room with my old laptop, the screen reflecting my tired, determined face, running complex scripts and deep network queries into old, compromised accounts. But I found it. I followed Serena's encrypted communications, noticing the strange, almost childlike coded language she was using in texts that were supposed to be about her charity work and art acquisitions, which was far too specific to be innocent and didn't match her cold, sophisticated persona. And I found the pattern, the digital fingerprint that led me straight to Marco Rossi, Damien's rival, and the southern Italian mafia boss who loved chaos and had a known appetite for destruction. The very man I suspected was behind the explosion that almost killed us both. I used a small, barely detectable exploit in a messaging app she favored, a security flaw I had learned how to fix for a client who had a data leak issue. And quietly, without leaving a trace, I copied the entire contents of her phone, downloading the proof I needed onto a pristine flash drive. It was all there. The logistics of the hit on the penthouse, the names of the men involved, the financial transactions detailing her payment for the betrayal, and Serena's chillingly casual instructions, all of it pointing straight to her as the traitor Damien had been hunting for 2 long, chaotic, bloody years. I didn't rush to him. I waited until the next morning, until the world was quiet and he was in his study, sitting behind his massive, dark wood desk, looking tired and completely closed off, the burden of his empire resting heavily on his shoulders, his exhaustion visible in the lines around his eyes. I walked in, not with the defensive posture of a scolded child, but with the quiet, firm resolve of someone holding an undeniable truth, someone who had earned her place through action. I placed the small, encrypted flash drive, the one containing everything, on his desk, not sliding it or throwing it, but placing it gently, giving it the weight it deserved, the weight of a life saved and a massive betrayal exposed. I looked him straight in the eye, not begging, not crying, just stating my case, one last time, with quiet certainty, making the statement a declaration of my loyalty and capability. Believe me, just once. Look at this, and you will know everything. I didn't wait for him to react or to ask questions. I simply turned and walked back toward the door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm, terrified that he would dismiss me, that he would tell me to leave, that the evidence wouldn't be enough against a lifetime of prejudice. But just as I reached the handle, his voice, low and dangerous, stopped me. An order I couldn't ignore. Ava. Wait. I turned around, and he was no longer tired. He was hyper-alert, his eyes flashing with a predatory intensity, the ice melting away to reveal the dangerous animal beneath. As he looked from the small flash drive to my face, and back again, connecting the dots. He picked up the drive, plugged it into his computer, and watched the files load, his face completely unreadable, betraying nothing of the shock I knew he must be feeling. The next 30 minutes were agonizing, filled only with the faint clicking of his mouse and the sound of my shallow breathing as I stood by the door, completely still, waiting for judgment, waiting for the truth to hit him. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand across his jaw, a look of profound shock and reluctant, heavy respect washing over his face. I had inadvertently exposed the traitor who had almost destroyed him, the one he had chased through months of chaos and suspicion, the person closest to him. He looked at me, no longer seeing the drunk, messy girl from the cheap apartment, but the quiet, unassuming woman who was more dangerous, more capable, and more loyal than he had realized. That night, Damien called an immediate meeting, a quiet gathering of his most trusted men in the same smoke-filled room where I had been humiliated just weeks before, and he walked in with me on his arm, his fingers intertwined with mine. The act itself a powerful declaration that defied every traditional expectation. The air in the room was thick with tension and anticipation, and the men, who had sneered at me before, now looked at me with a mixture of confusion, caution, and a palpable new respect, understanding the gravity of the betrayal. Damien didn't explain what had happened, not yet. He simply looked around the room, his eyes sharp and unforgiving, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was deadly quiet, measured, and final. Serena Vale is no longer welcome in this city, in this organization, or in my sight. Her actions have proven her to be a traitor, a pawn of Marco Rossi, driven by greed and ambition. He paused, letting the damning information sink into the silence, letting the implications of her betrayal settle over every man present, the shock evident on their faces. Then, he looked directly at me, wrapping his arms securely around my shoulders, drawing me close to his side, and his voice rose slightly, the tone one of ultimate, absolute, and non-negotiable authority. She touched the woman who is now mine. She attempted to harm the woman who saved my life. Anyone who touches her, who speaks ill of her, who treats her with anything less than the respect due to me, will die. Do you understand? The collective nods were instant and deep, the message received loud and clear. Ava Collins, the useless girl, was now untouchable, secured not by a temporary favor, but by a promise that was heavier than gold and more binding than law. A part of his infrastructure. The immediate fallout was immense, and watching the consequences unfold felt like a silent, satisfying correction of the world's imbalance, the quiet dignity I had carried finally being recognized and validated by the only people whose judgment mattered. Serena was gone the next day, her face a mask of shocked, silent fury, banished and stripped of her status, her reputation dissolving instantly, the fall from grace visible to everyone who had ever envied her position. Julian, whose betrayal had been so public and cruel, found his undercover cop status suddenly and brutally exposed by Damien's quiet influence, his complex web of lies unraveling, his career dissolving overnight in a public scandal about police corruption and compromised information. He didn't lose his life, but he lost his purpose, his power, and his standing, his entire identity, the very thing he measured his worth by. which, in his world, was a fate worse than death. I didn't gloat. I didn't linger on their suffering, finding no pleasure in their downfall. I just watched, quietly, and turned my focus forward, concentrating on the work and on building my own strength and competence within this dangerous new structure. But even with Damien's fierce protection, the whispers didn't stop. They only changed, becoming darker and more insidious. And the true problem with being loved by a king in that kind of cold, ruthless world is that love always looks like a curse to those who value power over people, a sign of weakness to be exploited. Julian managed to find me one afternoon, managing to slip past a couple of guards before being dragged away, his eyes wide and panicked, filled with the self-pity of a man who'd lost everything. "Stay with him and you'll die, Ava. He'll destroy you because you make him weak," he screamed, his voice desperate and thin, finally showing the concern he'd hidden all along. But I knew his fear wasn't for me. It was for the chaos I represented, the instability I brought to the system. The Mafia whispers grew louder, more insistent, spreading like a virus. Moretti is weakening because of a girl. She's his vulnerability, his soft spot, a fatal flaw. Serena, even from exile, managed to leak her final, most damaging lie. Ava flirted her way into power. She's just a clever whore who used a secret code to trap a desperate man, nothing more than a tool he now feels obligated to protect. Damien knew the truth, but the perception, the fear that I was his Achilles' heel, forced him to pull back again. He grew cold, distant, professional, focusing on tightening his control and eliminating the remaining threats, believing that if he treated me like an employee, if he didn't show any affection, it would protect me from being targeted as his weakness, a calculated act of emotional distance. But I misinterpreted his silence completely, seeing only the surface and projecting my old fears of abandonment. I saw his distance as rejection, his coldness as regret that he had made such a public commitment, that the chaos I caused wasn't worth the truth I brought. I convinced myself that I had served my purpose, exposed the traitor, and now I was nothing more than an inconvenient artifact he had to protect out of obligation, a promise he couldn't break but one he resented. The man who had described my cheap perfume and the tiny anchor charm with such intense focus now treated me like a ghost in his massive, sterile house, a figure to be guarded but not touched. The warmth of the fire that had ignited between us after the explosion cooled into a sterile, professional regard, and the silence became deafening. I started carrying my bag everywhere, subconsciously preparing for the moment he would finally tell me to leave. The fear of being disposable, the feeling of being a passing amusement, cutting me deeper than any of Serena's slaps because it came from the man I trusted. I spent my days quietly planning my escape, trying to figure out how to reclaim my small, unremarkable life, because I didn't want his empire, and I didn't want his protection if it came without his heart, believing that my quiet dignity meant nothing to him anymore. The distance between us grew into a massive, echoing chasm, and I felt more alone in his penthouse than I ever had in my tiny, cheap apartment, the silence amplifying my feelings of inadequacy, making me believe the whispers. The ultimate test came during a massive, clandestine gathering of the major Mafia families, a tense, brutal negotiation over territory and loyalty, the atmosphere thick with danger and unspoken rules. Damien had insisted I be there, sitting quietly in a corner, an untouchable symbol of his authority and resolve, watching and learning. The room was thick with cigar smoke and mistrust, the air heavy with unspoken threats and centuries of grudges, the very foundation of their power. That's when Marco Rossi, the snake I had helped expose, entered the room, his eyes cold and mocking, and he walked right up to the head table, pausing just long enough to sneer at Damien with true venom, a man intent on provoking a deadly reaction. A whole empire shaken by one sexy text, Marco jeered, his voice loud and contemptuous, his eyes sliding over to me, full of calculated dismissal, trying to provoke me into an emotional reaction that would prove his point. The great Damien Moretti, distracted and weakened by a cheap, desperate girl who sent a drunken, flirty text to the wrong man. You are a fool to choose her over tradition and stability. He paused, letting the insult hang in the air, allowing the seeds of doubt and mockery to plant themselves in the minds of the other bosses, aiming his barb straight at Damien's loyalty and judgment. The air solidified. Every head in the room turned to Damien, waiting for the eruption, waiting for the violent, controlled rage that usually followed such a profound slight, waiting for him to confirm the weakness. Instead, Damien slowly, deliberately, rose from his chair, his movements smooth and terrifyingly controlled, the absolute focus of the room falling on him, a man who had already made his decision. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he just walked toward me, every eye in the room following his path, and he stopped right in front of my chair. Then, in a moment that defied every single rule, every custom, and every expectation of that cold, powerful world, he pulled me up, right into his arms, and held me tightly against his chest, a gesture of ownership and fierce, unyielding love, broadcasting his devotion to the most dangerous men in the city. Making me his flag, he looked over my head, directly at Marco Rossi, and his voice, though not loud, carried the weight of absolute power and the finality of his decision. A cold, hard vow. "She is not my weakness, Marco," he declared, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor, establishing the new order. "She's the reason I'm still alive. She exposed your traitor when all your men failed. She is the quiet strength that keeps my empire standing, and anyone who threatens her threatens me." He publicly declared Ava Collins, the outside, messy girl, as the woman who stood beside him, the woman who was untouchable, the reason for his continued existence, making it impossible for anyone to touch me without declaring war on him. The entire room was stunned into absolute silence. No boss, ever, had protected an outsider with such fierce, public commitment. He then looked down at me, a flicker of warmth finally breaking through the ice in his eyes, a silent apology for the distance he'd kept, a promise of something more than just protection. He turned back to the room, his arm still wrapped around me. A clear, definitive statement that required no further discussion. "Serena is banished from my territory forever. Her name will not be spoken again. Now, we discuss the borders, and you will remember who stands here." That was the end of it. The matter was closed, the challenge met, and the man who was feared for his ruthless calculation had chosen love and loyalty over the safety of the centuries-old rules, valuing the truth, the promise he'd made, and the quiet, unassuming girl who had saved his life, over the dictates of his dark, dangerous world. I didn't get to enjoy the quiet victory for long, though, because in that world, a public declaration of love is not a shield. It's a target, the biggest, brightest one in the room. Marco Rossi, desperate to prove that love destroys kings, and fueled by the humiliation of being exposed, didn't try to fight Damien in public. He came for me, the acknowledged weakness, the key to his destruction. It happened fast, a sudden, brutal grab and drag as I was leaving a small, legitimate meeting I was conducting for Damien's social media marketing, a routine task that made me feel normal for a few minutes. I remember the rough cloth over my mouth, the sharp, metallic tang of fear, and then waking up tied to a cold wooden chair in a derelict warehouse, the air stale and dusty, my wrists burning against the cheap ropes, and my mind racing with panicked thoughts of escape. Marco stood over me, his face twisted in a look of ugly triumph, the final piece of his twisted game finally in place, his revenge palpable. "Everything started with your stupid little message, Ava," he hissed, kicking the chair with a cruel, unnecessary force, enjoying my terror. "You thought you were clever, but now, it ends with you and your king." He shoved a burner phone into my face, the screen already lit, the number already dialed, forcing me to look at the contact name. "Call him here. Call your powerful king. Or watch him die piece by piece because he came alone, proving he values you over his life, and I want everyone to see it." I sobbed, the sound tearing from my throat, feeling the crushing weight of everything that had happened. The terrible, sickening realization that I truly was a curse to Damien's life, that my existence led only to his destruction. I was the target, the reason he would fall, and the text that started it all had finally led to the ultimate disaster. I refused to call, refusing to be his bait. But Marco simply laughed, his cold, flat eyes shining with cruel amusement. Knowing he had me cornered, he set up his phone, aiming it at my tear-stained face, capturing the fear in my eyes, and started a live stream, a dark, chaotic broadcast to the whole criminal underworld, an ultimate show of dominance, an act of public execution. "Choose, Damian Moretti," he snarled into the camera, looking straight into the lens, his voice echoing in the derelict warehouse, designed to shatter Damian's composure. "Choose, your empire or your girl. Let's see if love can truly destroy a king, or if he's just a romantic fool." My head slumped, my chest tight with a hopeless, crushing certainty that Damian, the ruthless boss, the man of calculation and control, wouldn't choose the messy, low-status girl over his entire empire, that he would be forced to make the logical, brutal decision to save his world. I was just a moment, a distraction, and now I was an impossible liability he would have to sacrifice for the greater good. The door blew inward before I could even finish the desperate thought, not with a massive, deafening bang, but with a silent, controlled thud of a preset charge, and the sudden, swirling dust obscured everything for a split second, making the scene a chaotic, blinding mess. Then, through the dust and the chaos, I saw him, standing alone, exactly as Marco had demanded, exactly as I had feared and prayed he wouldn't. Damian, without his guards, without his backup, looking more dangerous and more alive than I had ever seen him, a man completely resolved, standing there in the debris. Marco stood ready, weapon drawn, a cruel, triumphant smile plastered across his face, thinking he had won, thinking he had finally trapped the great Damian Moretti in the ultimate checkmate. But Damian just looked past Marco, straight into my eyes, and his expression was one of quiet, terrifying resolve, completely calm in the face of certain death. He dropped a hidden package to the ground, a small, square device that I immediately knew was a detonator for preset charges, proving he had prepared for this exact outcome. And he spoke, his voice low and steady, repeating the words that had started this entire, terrible, wonderful journey. "If you still want me, say the word." The line, the flirty, demanding, embarrassing text I'd sent drunkenly to the wrong person, was now his ultimate question, his final declaration of faith, giving me the last, impossible choice in this game of life and death, confirming that he needed my choice to survive, that he wouldn't act without my affirmation. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the empire, the fear, or the danger. I only saw the love, the promise, the man who had risked everything, who had walked into an explosive trap for me, putting his life in my hands. I screamed the words, tearing them from the deepest part of my soul. "I want you," and the moment the sound left my mouth, the second explosion, the one I had heard in the flashback before, ripped through the building, a calculated, perfectly timed blast that threw Marco and the guards into the air, proving that Damian Moretti was never unprepared, never weak, and always, always 2 steps ahead of his enemies, turning the trap back on the hunter and shattering the live stream. The blast snapped the ropes binding me, the shockwave shattering the bonds, and I fell hard, my shoulder hitting the cold, dusty floor. But my eyes were fixed on the gun that had flown from Marco's hand, lying just inches away from my trembling fingers. I scrambled for it, grabbing the cold, heavy metal with a newfound certainty, a silent, deadly resolve taking over, and as Marco, dazed and bloody, began to rise, his eyes wide with shocked, murderous realization, I pointed the weapon at his chest and pulled the trigger. Not with a burst of fury, but with the quiet, cold resolve I'd learned from him, a final, necessary act of self-preservation, saving the life of the man who had saved mine. Damian, bloody and breathless, but alive, was instantly by my side, pulling me up and into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. But I didn't care. His heartbeat was the only sound I needed to hear, the only proof of reality. 5 minutes after your text, I came to your door, ready to kill a traitor or protect an insider, he murmured against my hair, his voice rough with emotion and residual shock, his body trembling slightly as the sirens screamed outside, closer this time, confirming the absolute chaos we had survived together. 5 minutes after this, we start our life, Ava. We build it, far away from all this ash and smoke. That life starts right now. You see, for the longest time, I thought being quiet meant being small. I thought being unseen meant I was unimportant, easily dismissed, easily forgotten. I let the shame of being poor, the humiliation of being judged for my chaos, define me. But it wasn't the flirty text that changed everything. It was the fact that when the world decided to knock me down, when the absolute pressure was on, I didn't just stay down. I got up, I looked hard, and I hit back with the only currency that mattered, the cold, hard truth that no one else could see, and the quiet resolve that surprised even a Mafia boss. I was never small. I was just quiet. And I found the one man who didn't want a trophy, but a weapon who would stand by his side, capable of fighting in the dark, and seeing the unseen truth beneath the surface. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below, and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.